The champagne glass slipped from my fingers and shattered against the marble floor of my son's penthouse apartment. Not from shock, not from anger, but from the sheer weight of finally hearing what David really thought of me after all these years. "Poor old Mom," he had announced to his circle of trust fund friends, his voice dripping with embarrassment as he gestured toward me standing by the kitchen island. "She still thinks designer handbags come from outlet malls and that a good investment is a savings account earning 2% interest." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel exactly, but it was dismissive in a way that cut deeper than cruelty ever could. These 28-year-olds with their inherited wealth and startup ventures saw me as David's charity case, the woman who raised him in a modest 2-bedroom house and drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic. What they didn't know, what David didn't know, was that the woman they were laughing at had more money in offshore accounts than all of their families combined. $53 million to be exact. Money I had earned, invested, and hidden so carefully that not even my own son suspected the truth. I bent down to pick up the larger pieces of glass, my hands steady despite the storm building in my chest. This wasn't the first time David had dismissed me in front of his friends, but something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the way his girlfriend Sophia had smirked when he called me poor. Maybe it was how he'd introduced me to his business partners as just my mom, with that particular emphasis that made it clear I was someone to be tolerated rather than respected. Or maybe it was simply that after 30 years of playing the role of the struggling single mother, I was tired of the performance. The party had started 3 hours earlier, with David's usual flair for excess. His downtown Manhattan apartment, which he'd purchased with money from his trust fund at 25, was filled with the kind of people who measured success by the size of their social media following and the exclusivity of their gym memberships. I had arrived precisely on time, carrying a simple gift bag containing a watch I'd carefully selected from Tiffany's, though I'd removed it from its distinctive blue box and placed it in generic packaging. David had trained me well over the years to downplay any gesture that might seem too generous, too knowing, too much like I understood the world he desperately wanted to belong to. The irony wasn't lost on me that my son, who prided himself on his business acumen and his ability to read people, had never once questioned how a woman who supposedly struggled financially had managed to raise him in relative comfort, pay for his private school education, and never once ask him for money even when he became successful. He had constructed an entire narrative about my limitations that conveniently absolved him of any guilt about his own privilege, while simultaneously allowing him to feel superior to the woman who had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities. I had been standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Hudson River, nursing a glass of champagne and listening to a conversation about cryptocurrency investments, when David's voice had cut through the ambient noise of the party. He was standing with 3 other men near his home bar, a custom piece that had cost more than most people's cars, gesticulating with the kind of animated confidence that came from never having been truly challenged or humbled by life. "The problem? With my mother," he was saying, his words slightly slurred from the expensive whiskey he'd been drinking, "is that she's stuck in this middle-class mindset. She thinks rich people are somehow different from everyone else, like we have some secret knowledge or special abilities. She doesn't understand that wealth is just a matter of making smart decisions and taking calculated risks." One of his friends, a pale young man with perfectly styled hair and a watch that probably cost more than my supposed annual income, had nodded sagely. "It's generational trauma, man. Our parents grew up with scarcity mindsets. They can't see abundance even when it's right in front of them." Another friend, a woman with honey blonde hair and the kind of casual designer outfit that screamed inherited wealth, had glanced in my direction with what I could only describe as pity. "It must be hard for her, though, watching you succeed when she probably feels like she failed." David had laughed then, a sound that carried no real humor. "She didn't fail exactly. She just never understood that being comfortable isn't the same as being successful. She thinks her little government job with benefits and a pension is security. She doesn't get that real security comes from building wealth, from making money work for you instead of working for money. That's when he'd noticed me approaching, when he'd made the comment about poor old mom and designer handbags. That's when I'd dropped the champagne glass and felt something inside me shift permanently. The truth was, David's father had left us when David was 3 years old, disappearing with his secretary and a substantial portion of our joint savings. I had been 28, with a toddler, a mortgage, and a job as a junior analyst at a mid-tier investment firm. The divorce settlement had been minimal, the child support sporadic and eventually non-existent. David remembered none of this, of course. His earliest memories were of the modest but comfortable house I'd bought when he was 5, the private school I'd enrolled him in when he was 7, the summer camps and music lessons and sports equipment that had filled his childhood. What he didn't remember, what I had never told him, was how I had turned our desperate situation into opportunity. How I had spent every evening after putting him to bed studying market trends, learning about emerging technologies, and slowly, carefully, building a portfolio of investments that would eventually make me wealthier than I had ever dreamed possible. The government job he dismissed so casually had been my cover, my explanation for how a single mother could afford the life I was providing for him. In reality, it had been my investments in early-stage tech companies, my carefully timed real estate purchases, and my diversified international holdings that had funded our comfortable existence. I had started small, using the settlement money to buy shares in a little-known company called Microsoft when David was 4. I had invested in Apple when everyone said personal computers were a fad. I had bought Amazon stock when it was just an online bookstore and Google when it was a search engine nobody had heard of. Every major tech boom of the last 25 years, I had been there, quietly accumulating wealth while maintaining the facade of the struggling single mother. The irony was that David's dismissive attitude toward my supposed financial limitations had actually helped me maintain my cover. Every time he assumed I couldn't afford something, every time he explained basic financial concepts to me as if I were a child, every time he picked up a dinner check with the kind of theatrical generosity that suggested he was doing me an enormous favor, he was reinforcing the very narrative that allowed me to continue flying under the radar. Standing in his kitchen now, surrounded by the remnants of broken glass and the echo of his cruel laughter, I found myself thinking about all the times I could have revealed the truth. When he'd graduated from college and immediately started lecturing me about the importance of financial planning. When he'd bought his first apartment and spent 20 minutes explaining the concept of equity to me as if I hadn't been investing in real estate for 15 years. When he'd started his consulting firm and condescendingly offered to help me optimize my retirement savings. Each time, I had bitten my tongue and played the role he needed me to play. I had told myself that my secrecy was protection, that revealing my wealth would change our relationship in ways that might not be positive. I had convinced myself that allowing him to feel superior was a small price to pay for maintaining the close bond we had shared throughout his childhood and young adulthood. But tonight, listening to him reduce me to a caricature of middle-class limitations in front of people who would never see me as anything more than an embarrassment, I realized that our relationship had already changed. It had been changing for years, so gradually that I hadn't noticed the shift from loving son to patronizing adult who saw me as a burden rather than a person. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. David was approaching now, his expression a mixture of concern and irritation. Behind him, I could see Sophia watching with the kind of detached interest of someone observing a drama that didn't directly involve her. The other party guests had returned to their conversations, but I could feel their occasional glances, their whispered speculation about what had caused poor old mom to drop her champagne glass. "Are you okay?" David asked, his tone suggesting that my answer should be brief and uncomplicated. "You seem upset about something." I looked up at him from where I was still crouched on the floor, studying his face as if seeing it clearly for the first time. He had my eyes, dark brown and almond-shaped, but everything else about him had come from his father. The strong jawline, the thick hair that he wore slightly longer than was fashionable, the tall, lean frame that looked good in the expensive clothes he favored. He was handsome in the way that opened doors and created opportunities, but there was something soft about him too. Something that came from never having to fight for anything he really wanted. "I'm fine," I said, standing slowly and brushing off my hands. "Just clumsy, I suppose." He relaxed visibly, clearly relieved that I wasn't going to make a scene. "Good. Listen, I wanted to introduce you to Marcus Wellington. He's thinking about investing in the firm, and I thought you might enjoy meeting him. He went to Princeton, like you always wanted me to." The casual cruelty of that last comment took my breath away. I had never pushed David toward any particular college, had never expressed disappointment about his choice to attend a perfectly respectable state university. But he had rewritten our history to fit his narrative, turning my support into pressure and my pride into manipulation. It was a masterful bit of revision, the kind that allowed him to feel both grateful for my sacrifices and resentful of my supposed expectations. Marcus Wellington turned out to be exactly what I expected. Early 30s, expensively educated, and possessed of the kind of casual arrogance that came from inheriting wealth so vast, it had long since stopped feeling real. He shook my hand, with the kind of firm grip that was supposed to convey respect, but felt more like tolerance, his eyes already scanning the room for more interesting conversations. "David tells me you work for the city," he said, his tone suggesting that municipal employment was roughly equivalent to unemployment. "That must be very rewarding work." The word rewarding was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, carrying all the implications that weren't being spoken aloud. Rewarding because it certainly wasn't lucrative. Rewarding because someone had to do the unglamorous work of keeping society functioning. Rewarding in the way that charity work was. Rewarding, noble but ultimately insignificant in the grand scheme of things. "It has its moments," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Though I have to admit, I sometimes find private sector work more interesting. The innovation, the risk-taking, the potential for real wealth creation." Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly, as if he was surprised that someone like me would have opinions about wealth creation. "Do you invest at all? I mean, beyond the standard retirement accounts?" David laughed before I could answer. "Mom's idea of a risky investment is buying the extended warranty on her car. She's very conservative with money." "Conservative can buy tiyad. Be smart," Marcus said diplomatically, though his attention was already wandering. "Especially for people who can't afford to lose what they have. People who can't afford to lose what they have." The phrase echoed in my mind as Marcus excused himself to refresh his drink, and David moved on to another group of guests. It was such a perfect encapsulation of how these people saw me, not as an individual with agency and intelligence, but as someone whose circumstances had been predetermined by forces beyond my control. Someone whose financial situation was a result of limited understanding rather than deliberate choice. I found myself thinking about the portfolio review I had conducted just last week with my private wealth manager, Jonathan Kessler, a man whose client list included several billionaires, and who treated my account with the kind of serious attention that reflected its substantial value. We had discussed my holdings in emerging markets, my position in a promising biotech startup, and my recent acquisition of a commercial property in downtown Seattle that was already appreciating faster than projected. Jonathan had congratulated me on my timing with the Seattle purchase, noting that my instincts for real estate investment continued to be remarkably sharp. "Your diversification strategy is particularly impressive," he had said, scrolling through the detailed breakdown of my assets. "Most people with your level of wealth get lazy, stick with blue chips and government bonds, but you've maintained this aggressive, intelligent approach that's really paying off." If Jonathan could see me now, playing the role of the financially naive mother at my son's party, he would probably think I'd lost my mind. But that was the point, wasn't it? The performance was so complete, so consistent, that even David, who had grown up watching me make what he assumed were modest financial decisions, had never questioned the disconnect between my supposed limitations and the comfortable life we had always led. The party continued around me. A swirl of expensive clothes and expensive opinions and expensive problems that weren't really problems at all. I listened to conversations about the difficulty of finding good help, the impossibility of getting reservations at the right restaurants, the exhausting process of renovating vacation homes. These people were so insulated from real struggle that they had invented elaborate substitutes, turning minor inconveniences into major dramas worthy of extended discussion and mutual sympathy. David was in his element, moving from group to group, with the kind of easy confidence that came from knowing he belonged. He had always been socially gifted, even as a child, able to read a room and adapt his personality to fit the situation. It was a useful skill in business, I supposed, though watching him deploy it now made me feel oddly sad. There was something performative about his interactions, as if he was constantly auditioning for approval rather than simply enjoying the company of people he genuinely liked. When he was younger, before he had discovered the intoxicating world of inherited wealth and social climbing, David had been different, more genuine, more curious about the world beyond his immediate experience. I remembered him at 15, asking thoughtful questions about current events, expressing genuine concern for classmates who were struggling financially, showing interest in volunteer work and social justice causes. Somewhere along the way, that idealistic teenager had been replaced by this polished young man who measured success by proximity to money and power. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, of course. It had been a gradual process, accelerated by his admission to a prestigious private university where he had met other wealthy students for the first time. He had come home from his freshman year with new opinions about economics and politics, new ideas about what constituted success and failure. By his senior year, he was already talking about the importance of networking, of surrounding yourself with the right kind of people, of positioning yourself for maximum advantage in the marketplace of life. I had watched this evolution with a mixture of pride and concern. Pride because he was clearly thriving in his new environment, making connections and building the kind of social capital that would serve him well in his career. Concern because I could see him losing touch with the values I had tried to instill in him, the empathy and humility that had made him such a wonderful child. The moment that had crystallized my fears came during his junior year, when he had brought a girlfriend home for Christmas break. Sarah was a lovely girl from a middle-class family, smart and funny, and clearly smitten with David. But I had watched him throughout that visit, seen how he deflected her questions about our modest house, how he steered conversations away from topics that might reveal our supposedly limited financial circumstances. When she had admired the simple jewelry I was wearing and asked where I had bought it, David had quickly changed the subject, as if her interest in my possessions was somehow embarrassing. After Sarah left, I had tried to talk to David about what I had observed, but he had brushed off my concerns with the kind of dismissive confidence that was becoming his default response to any form of criticism. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," he had said. "These people expect a certain level of sophistication. If they think I come from some working-class background, it affects how they see me, how they judge my potential." "And what's wrong with a working-class background?" I had asked. "Nothing's wrong with it," he had replied quickly. "But it's not who I am anymore. I've worked hard to elevate myself, to build something better. I can't let their preconceptions limit what I can achieve." That conversation had stayed with me for years, not because of what David had said, but because of what he hadn't said. He hadn't denied that he was embarrassed by our circumstances. He hadn't reassured me that he valued our relationship more than the opinions of his college friends. He had simply made it clear that managing his image was more important than acknowledging the reality of where he had come from. Now, standing in his expensive apartment surrounded by his expensive friends, I could see that the pattern established in college had only intensified over time. David hadn't just distanced himself from his supposed working-class roots. He had actively constructed a narrative that positioned me as a burden rather than a source of strength. Every time he explained my financial limitations to someone, every time he made excuses for my modest lifestyle, every time he treated my presence as something to be managed rather than enjoyed, he was reinforcing his own social position at my expense. The realization was both liberating and devastating. Liberating because it freed me from the obligation to maintain a performance that was clearly serving his needs, rather than protecting our relationship. Devastating because it forced me to acknowledge that the son I had raised, the man I had sacrificed everything to support and protect, had become someone who saw me as an impediment to his success, rather than the foundation upon which it was built. I was still lost in these thoughts when Sophia appeared beside me, her smile bright and obviously forced. She was beautiful in the way that money often produced, perfectly maintained, expensively styled, and possessed of the kind of confidence that came from never having to question whether she deserved the best of everything. "I hope you're having a good time," she said, her voice carrying the kind of polite concern that suggested she had been assigned the task of managing me. "David mentioned that you don't get out much." David had mentioned that I don't get out much. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away, as if I were some sort of shut-in, some pathetic figure who needed to be coaxed into social situations and carefully supervised to ensure I didn't embarrass myself or anyone else. The truth was that I declined most of David's invitations not because I was antisocial or insecure, but because I had grown tired of playing the role of the grateful, overwhelmed mother who was clearly out of her depth in his sophisticated world. "I stay busy," I replied, keeping my voice light. "Different kinds of activities, perhaps, but busy nonetheless." Sophia nodded as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "David tells me you're very devoted to your job." "That's admirable. I mean, I could never work for the government. All that bureaucracy and red tape. It must be so frustrating to deal with all those restrictions and limitations." The irony was almost too perfect to be accidental. Here was this woman, who had never worked a day in her life, explaining to me the limitations of government employment while standing in an apartment that had been purchased with family money, wearing clothes that had been bought with family money, living a life that was entirely subsidized by family money. She had no conception of what work actually meant, what it was like to build something from nothing, what it felt like to succeed based on merit rather than inheritance. "Every job has its challenges," I said diplomatically. "Though I have to admit, I've always been interested in the private sector as well. Investment, particularly. The complexity of the markets, the psychological aspects of financial decision-making." Sophia's expression shifted slightly, as if she wasn't sure how to process this information. "Oh, do you have investment accounts?" "Some," I replied. "Nothing too sophisticated, of course." This seemed to reassure her. "David mentioned that you're very conservative with money, which makes sense, obviously. When you don't have much to begin with, you can't really afford to take risks. When you don't have much to begin with, you can't really afford to take risks." The statement was so fundamentally wrong, so completely backwards, that I almost laughed out loud. The truth was that people with limited resources were often the most willing to take calculated risks, because they understood that conservative strategies alone would never generate the kind of wealth that could change their circumstances. It was people like Sophia, people who had inherited their financial security, who could afford to be truly conservative because they had never faced the choice between playing it safe and remaining poor forever. But explaining this to Sophia would require revealing more about myself than I was prepared to share, so I simply nodded and let her continue with her assessment of my supposed financial limitations. She moved on to other topics, asking polite questions about my work and my hobbies and my plans for retirement. each question carefully designed to confirm her existing assumptions about my circumstances and prospects. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of David's voice rising above the general noise of the party. He was standing near the windows again, this time with a larger group of people, gesticulating with the kind of animated enthusiasm that suggested he was telling a story he particularly enjoyed. "The funny thing is," he was saying, "she still thinks rich people are different from everyone else. Like we have some secret knowledge or special access to information that regular people don't have. She doesn't understand that wealth is really just about making smart decisions and having the confidence to act on them." I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I realized he was talking about me again, using me as an example to illustrate some point about the psychology of financial limitation. The people around him were nodding and laughing, clearly entertained by his analysis of his poor old mother's failure to understand the realities of wealth creation. "It's actually kind of sad," one of his friends was saying. "Like, she's obviously intelligent, but she's trapped in this mindset where she thinks money is this mysterious force that only special people can access." "Exactly," David replied. "And the ironic thing is that her fear of risk is exactly what keeps her poor. She's so worried about losing what little she has that she never takes the chances that could actually improve her situation. Her fear of risk is exactly what keeps her poor." I stood there listening to my son explain my financial psychology to a room full of people who had never faced a real financial decision in their lives, people whose wealth was entirely inherited and therefore completely divorced from any kind of risk assessment or decision-making process. The audacity of it was breathtaking, but what hurt more than the audacity was the certainty. David wasn't speculating about my limitations. He genuinely believed he understood them better than I understood them myself. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. Not in that moment exactly, but in the slow, deliberate process of realizing that the performance I had maintained for so many years was no longer serving anyone, least of all the son I had worked so hard to protect. David had become someone who needed to see me as poor in order to feel rich. Someone who needed to see me as limited in order to feel unlimited. Someone who needed to see me as a failure in order to feel successful. The truth would shatter all of that, of course. The revelation that his poor old mother had more money than everyone at this party combined would force him to reconsider not just his assumptions about me, but his assumptions about wealth and success and the nature of intelligence itself. It would be devastating, but it might also be liberating. For both of us. I excused myself from Sophia's company and walked slowly toward the group gathered around David, my mind clear and my purpose crystallizing with every step. I wasn't going to confront him here, in front of his friends, with the kind of dramatic revelation that would humiliate him and provide entertainment for people who didn't deserve to witness his moment of reckoning. But I was going to plant the seeds of doubt, the small inconsistencies that would eventually force him to question everything he thought he knew about the woman who had raised him. The game was about to change, though David didn't know it yet. Soon, very soon, poor old Mom was going to reveal exactly what $53 million worth of patience looked like when it finally ran out. The morning after David's party, I sat in my small kitchen drinking coffee from a mug that had cost me $12 at Target, staring at the portfolio summary that had arrived in my email at 6 a.m. sharp. Jonathan Kessler's weekly reports were always meticulous, breaking down my holdings across 17 different asset classes and 12 international markets. This week's numbers showed a net gain of $2.7 million, primarily driven by my early stake in a quantum computing startup that had just announced a major breakthrough in error correction. I scrolled through the detailed analysis, while eating toast with strawberry jam, the mundane nature of my breakfast providing an almost surreal contrast to the figures on my laptop screen. The biotech company I had invested in 3 years earlier was up another 18% following successful Phase 2 trials for their Alzheimer's treatment. My commercial real estate holdings in Austin and Denver continued to appreciate at rates that exceeded even Jonathan's optimistic projections. The cryptocurrency portfolio, which represented less than 5% of my total wealth but still amounted to nearly $3 million, had recovered from last month's volatility and was trending upward again. Most people would find this kind of wealth overwhelming, but I had grown accustomed to thinking in large numbers over the years. What struck me instead was how disconnected these figures felt from the life I actually lived. The careful performance, a financial limitation that had become so natural I sometimes forgot it was an act. The woman who had stood in David's kitchen last night, listening to him explain her psychological barriers to wealth creation, existed in a completely different universe from the woman who owned a portfolio worth more than most small companies. The phone rang at 8:30, interrupting my review of the quarterly hedge fund reports. It was David, his voice carrying the slightly strained cheerfulness that always followed one of his parties. "Hey, Mom, just wanted to make sure you got home okay last night. You left pretty early." I had left at exactly 10:15, after David had spent another 20 minutes holding court about the fundamental differences between people who understood money and people who were intimidated by it. His analysis had grown more elaborate as the evening progressed, incorporating theories about generational trauma, educational limitations, and the psychological impact of growing up during economic uncertainty. By the time I excused myself, he had constructed an entire academic framework to explain why someone like me would never be able to think like someone like him. "I had a lovely time," I said, keeping my voice warm. "Thank you for including me." "Of course. Listen, I was thinking we should have lunch soon. There are some things I want to discuss with you about your financial planning. I know you're probably comfortable with your current situation, but I think there might be some opportunities to optimize your portfolio, even with your conservative approach." Your conservative approach. The phrase made me smile despite myself. If only David knew that my so-called conservative approach had generated returns that averaged 23% annually over the past 15 years, significantly outperforming the broader market and putting most professional fund managers to shame. If only he knew that his poor old mother's optimization strategies were sophisticated enough that Jonathan Kessler regularly asked permission to share them, anonymously, with his other ultra-high net worth clients. "That's very thoughtful of you," I replied. "Though I should mention that I've been doing some research lately into alternative investment strategies. Nothing too aggressive, of course, but I'm curious about emerging markets and technology sectors." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that suggested David was recalibrating his assumptions about my level of financial sophistication. "Well, that's great, Mom. I mean, it's important to stay informed. Just remember that those sectors can be pretty volatile, especially for someone who's not used to managing risk at that level." Someone who's not used to managing risk at that level. I thought about my current position in a Vietnamese solar energy company that was about to announce a major government contract, my stake in a Brazilian lithium mining operation that was sitting on the largest undeveloped deposit in South America, my carefully researched investment in a Finnish artificial intelligence firm that was revolutionizing supply chain management. Risk management wasn't something I was learning about. It was something I had mastered while David was still in elementary school. "I'll be careful," I promised. "Maybe you could recommend some resources for learning more about these markets?" This seemed to reassure him. David loved being asked for advice, particularly when it reinforced his position as the financial expert in our relationship. He spent the next 10 minutes explaining the basics of international investing, covering topics like currency hedging and political risk assessment with the kind of patient condescension usually reserved for children or elderly relatives. I listened, carefully, making appropriate sounds of interest and gratitude, while simultaneously checking the performance of my emerging markets portfolio on my phone. The conversation ended with David promising to send me some beginner-friendly articles about global investing and a reminder that I should never make any major financial decisions without consulting him first. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about the elaborate fiction we had constructed together over the years. David believed he was protecting me from my own financial ignorance, while I believed I was protecting him from the complications that would arise if he knew the truth about my wealth. Both of us were probably wrong, but the momentum of our mutual deception had become so powerful that neither of us seemed capable of breaking free from it. The irony was that David's condescending attitude toward my supposed financial limitations had actually been useful in maintaining my cover. Every time he explained basic investment concepts to me, every time he expressed concern about my retirement planning, every time he offered to help me optimize my modest savings, he was reinforcing the very narrative that allowed me to continue operating below the radar. His assumptions about my capabilities provided the perfect camouflage for activities that would have seemed impossible for someone in my supposed circumstances. I had learned early in my wealth-building journey that discretion was not just advisable but essential. Too many people who experienced sudden financial success made the mistake of changing their lifestyle too quickly, drawing attention from family members, friends, and eventually government agencies that might ask uncomfortable questions about the source of their newfound prosperity. I had watched lottery winners destroy their lives by announcing their good fortune to the world, and I had seen successful entrepreneurs become targets for lawsuits and extortion attempts because they had been too eager to display their wealth. My approach had been different from the beginning. Every major financial gain had been carefully hidden within a lifestyle that remained deliberately modest. When my first big investment in a pharmaceutical company had returned 30-fold profits, I had used the money to pay off my mortgage early but continued living in the same small house. When my stake in a social media startup had sold for 8 figures, I had diversified the proceeds across multiple asset classes, but continued driving the same reliable Honda and shopping at the same discount grocery stores. The challenge had been explaining David's increasingly expensive education and activities without revealing the true source of my income. Private school tuition, summer programs, music lessons, sports equipment, college expenses, all of these had required careful management to appear reasonable within my supposed budget. I had become expert at finding plausible explanations for every expenditure, citing scholarships that didn't exist, gifts from relatives who barely knew us, and financial aid packages that had been mysteriously generous. David had never questioned these explanations because they fit perfectly with his understanding of how the world worked. Smart, deserving kids received help from institutions and individuals who recognized their potential. His mother was obviously intelligent and hardworking, so it made sense that she would be able to navigate systems and access resources that less capable parents might miss. He had attributed our comfortable life to my diligence and his own merit, never suspecting that the real explanation was far more complex and far more remarkable. The deception had grown more elaborate as David entered college and began developing his own sophisticated understanding of money and finance. I had been forced to create increasingly detailed explanations for discrepancies between my supposed income and our actual lifestyle. Government jobs were notoriously complex, I would explain, with pension contributions and health benefits and various allowances that could make a modest salary stretch farther than people might expect. I had become skilled at citing obscure regulations and bureaucratic programs that could theoretically account for our financial stability without revealing its true source. By the time David graduated and began his own career, the fiction had become so entrenched that neither of us could easily escape it. He had built his entire understanding of our relationship around the assumption that he was the successful one, the person who had transcended his modest origins through intelligence and determination. I had become invested in maintaining that narrative because it seemed to make him happy, and because revealing the truth would require explanations that I wasn't sure either of us was ready to handle. But last night had changed something fundamental in the equation. Listening to David explain my psychological limitations to a room full of people who had never earned $1 through their own efforts, watching him use my supposed failures as a way to establish his own superiority, I had realized that our arrangement was no longer serving either of us. David had become cruel in his condescension, and I had become complicit in my own diminishment. The performance that had once felt protective now felt destructive, and I could see that it was warping both of our characters in ways that might eventually become irreversible. I spent the rest of the morning walking through my neighborhood, thinking about the conversation I would eventually need to have with my son. The tree-lined streets and modest houses that surrounded me had been my home for more than 20 years, and I genuinely loved the sense of community and stability they provided. But I also knew that my attachment to this place was more complex than simple preference. Living here was part of the performance, part of the elaborate disguise that allowed me to operate as a multimillionaire while appearing to be exactly what I seemed. The neighbors who waved to me from their front yards, the shopkeepers who knew me by name, the librarians and postal workers and school crossing guards who had watched David grow up, all of them saw me as Margaret Chen, the hard-working single mother who had raised a successful son despite modest circumstances. None of them would ever suspect that Margaret Chen owned properties in 3 different countries, held controlling interests in 2 tech startups, and maintained investment accounts with some of the most exclusive wealth management firms in the world. That afternoon, I called Jonathan Kessler to discuss a proposal that had been forming in my mind since the previous evening. Jonathan's office in downtown Manhattan was designed to project the kind of understated luxury that appealed to clients who preferred discretion to ostentation. Persian rugs, leather-bound books, antique furniture that was beautiful but not flashy, artwork that was valuable but not obviously expensive. Jonathan himself embodied the same aesthetic, impeccably dressed but never flashy, knowledgeable but never condescending, wealthy but never ostentatious. "Margaret," he said, rising from behind his mahogany desk to greet me with a firm handshake. "Always a pleasure. I trust you've reviewed this week's portfolio summary?" "Thoroughly," I replied, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "The quantum computing position is performing even better than we projected. Your timing was impeccable, as usual. Most of my clients are still trying to understand the technology, but you identified the commercial potential months before the mainstream investment community caught on." This was one of the things I appreciated most about Jonathan. He never treated my investment acumen as surprising or unusual, despite the fact that my background was supposed to be in municipal government rather than high finance. From our first meeting 15 years earlier, when I had walked into his office with detailed analysis of emerging market opportunities that most professional investors were overlooking, he had simply accepted that I possessed an extraordinary gift for identifying undervalued assets and predicting market trends. "I wanted to discuss something with you today," I said, opening my briefcase and withdrawing a leather portfolio containing documents I had prepared that morning. "A rather significant change in strategy that will require careful coordination." Jonathan's expression sharpened with interest. He had managed my wealth long enough to know that my strategic changes were always carefully considered and usually highly profitable. "I'm thinking about disclosure," I continued. "Specifically, selective disclosure to my son. Not everything, obviously, but enough to fundamentally alter his understanding of our financial situation." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of his face. "May I ask what's prompting this consideration? You've been quite clear over the years about the importance of maintaining operational security." Operational security. It was a military term that Jonathan used to describe the elaborate measures we had taken to keep my wealth hidden from public view. Multiple shell companies, offshore accounts, carefully structured trusts, legal entities that existed solely to obscure the true ownership of various assets. The entire apparatus was designed to ensure that Margaret Chen, municipal employee, could never be connected to Margaret Chen, ultra-high net worth individual. "Family dynamics," I said simply. "My son has developed some troubling attitudes about money and success that are partially based on his misconceptions about my circumstances. I'm beginning to think that allowing these misconceptions to continue may be causing more harm than revealing the truth would." Jonathan nodded slowly. "I see. And what level of disclosure are you considering? I opened the portfolio and withdrew a single sheet of paper containing figures I had calculated that morning. Enough to establish credibility, but not enough to overwhelm him or create security concerns. Perhaps 20% of the actual holdings, structured in a way that appears to be the full picture. So roughly 10 million, Jonathan said, scanning the numbers. Enough to completely shift his perception of your financial sophistication, but not enough to raise questions about how someone in your position could have accumulated such wealth. Exactly. And I want to do it in a way that appears accidental, as if he's discovered something I was trying to keep private rather than something I was deliberately revealing. Jonathan smiled, the kind of expression that suggested he was already beginning to formulate a plan. Accidental discovery is an art form. It requires more careful choreography than direct revelation, but it can be much more effective in terms of psychological impact. We spent the next hour discussing logistics, how to structure the disclosure to appear believable, which assets to reveal and which to keep hidden, how to create documentation that would satisfy David's skepticism without raising questions about the source of the wealth, how to time the revelation for maximum impact while minimizing the risk of unintended consequences. By the time I left Jonathan's office, we had developed a comprehensive strategy that would unfold over the course of several weeks. David would discover, through a series of carefully orchestrated accidents and coincidences, that his poor old mother had been significantly more successful as an investor than she had ever let on. The revelation would be surprising, but not impossible. Impressive, but not unbelievable. Substantial enough to command respect, but not so substantial as to raise uncomfortable questions. The first step would happen the following week, when David and I had our scheduled lunch to discuss my financial planning. I would bring with me a folder containing investment statements that would appear to have been accidentally included with other documents. The statements would show a portfolio worth approximately $8 million, invested in a mixture of blue-chip stocks, government bonds, and conservative mutual funds. Nothing too sophisticated, nothing that would seem beyond the capabilities of a diligent government employee who had been saving and investing for 30 years, but enough to completely shatter David's assumptions about my financial limitations. The second step would occur several days later, when David would inevitably begin asking questions about how I had managed to accumulate such wealth without his knowledge. I would reluctantly reveal that I had been more successful with my investments than I had ever admitted, partly out of fear that he would worry about my risk-taking, and partly out of concern that he would see me differently if he knew I was wealthy. This explanation would satisfy his need to understand while reinforcing his assumption that he was the financially sophisticated one in our relationship. The third step would happen gradually over the following weeks, as I allowed David to glimpse additional evidence of my financial success, a casual mention of a real estate investment that had performed well, a reference to a stock purchase that had turned out better than expected, small revelations that would slowly expand his understanding of my capabilities without overwhelming him with the full scope of my wealth. The final step would be indefinite, a careful balancing act of selective honesty that would allow David to see me as more financially sophisticated than he had previously understood, while still maintaining the essential fiction that his own success represented a meaningful achievement relative to my modest accomplishments. He would learn that his mother was not the financial innocent he had assumed, but he would never discover that his mother was wealthy enough to buy and sell everyone at his party without affecting her quarterly budget. Walking home from Jonathan's office, I felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that reminded me of the early days of my investing career, when every decision felt momentous and every outcome uncertain. The plan we had developed was elegant in its simplicity, but it would require careful execution and constant attention to detail. One misplaced document, one poorly timed revelation, one moment of carelessness could expose far more than I intended, and destroy the careful balance I had maintained for so many years. But the alternative, continuing to play the role of the financially limited mother, while David grew increasingly contemptuous of my supposed ignorance, had become unbearable. Last night had shown me that our relationship was already damaged, perhaps irreparably, by the lies we had been telling each other. David's cruelty toward me was matched only by my dishonesty toward him, and both of us were trapped in patterns of behavior that prevented us from seeing each other clearly. The revelation I was planning would not solve everything, of course. David would still be someone who measured his own worth by comparison to others, someone who needed to feel superior in order to feel secure, someone who had learned to see relationships as zero-sum competitions rather than opportunities for mutual support. But it would force him to reconsider his assumptions about intelligence and success and the nature of financial achievement, and that reconsideration might, eventually, lead to something resembling wisdom. That evening, I sat in my living room, reviewing the documents Jonathan and I had prepared, making sure every detail was perfect, every number consistent, every explanation plausible. The fictional portfolio we had created was a masterpiece of careful deception, substantial enough to impress but conservative enough to seem believable, sophisticated enough to command respect but not so sophisticated as to raise suspicions about its origins. The Margaret Chen who existed in these documents was someone who had been quietly successful for decades, someone who had made smart choices and benefited from good timing and compound interest, someone who had been more capable than she appeared but not so capable as to seem suspicious. She was the kind of investor who might realistically accumulate $8 or $10 million over 30 years of disciplined saving and conservative risk-taking, the kind of person who might prefer to keep her success private rather than attract attention or envy. Tomorrow, I would call David to confirm our lunch plans. Next week, I would accidentally reveal the first piece of evidence that would begin dismantling his assumptions about his poor old mother. And in the weeks that followed, I would carefully manage the most delicate and important performance of my life, the gradual revelation of just enough truth to change everything without destroying everything. The game was about to begin, and this time, David would learn that his mother was a much more formidable player than he had ever imagined. The restaurant David had chosen for our lunch was exactly the kind of place that reinforced his image of himself as someone who understood quality and sophistication. Greystone Manor occupied the top floor of a converted warehouse in Soho, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered dramatic views of the city and prices that ensured the clientele consisted exclusively of people who didn't need to check their bank balance before ordering. The hostess, a striking woman in her 20s with the kind of effortless beauty that suggested either exceptional genetics or exceptional wealth, led us to a corner table that probably cost more to reserve than most people spent on groceries in a month. David was already seated when I arrived, scrolling through his phone with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was conducting important business rather than simply killing time. He looked up as I approached, his smile bright and genuine, in a way that reminded me of the boy he had been before he discovered the intoxicating world of social status and financial hierarchy. "You look great, Mom," he said, standing to give me a brief hug that felt both warm and somehow calculated, as if he was performing the role of the dutiful son for the benefit of anyone who might be watching. "I took the liberty of ordering you a glass of the Sancerre. I know you usually prefer white wine, and this one is supposed to be exceptional." The wine, when it arrived, was indeed exceptional, crisp and mineral, with the kind of complexity that suggested both careful cultivation and considerable expense. I sipped it slowly while David launched into an animated description of his latest business venture, a consulting firm that specialized in helping tech startups optimize their growth strategies. His enthusiasm was infectious, and for a moment, I found myself remembering why I had fallen in love with his intelligence and ambition when he was younger. "The beauty of the model is that we're not just providing advice," he was saying, his hands moving expressively as he spoke. "We're actually taking equity positions in the companies we work with, so our success is directly tied to their success. It's a much more sophisticated approach than traditional consulting, and it allows us to work with the kind of high-potential clients who are really going to change the world." I nodded encouragingly. genuinely impressed by the scope of his vision, even as I noted the casual way he dismissed traditional consulting as somehow beneath his current aspirations. David had always been good at identifying opportunities and articulating complex strategies, but somewhere along the way he had also developed the habit of positioning every new venture as a revolutionary improvement over whatever came before. "That sounds fascinating," I said, "and quite ambitious. I imagine it requires significant capital investment to take equity positions in multiple companies." David's expression shifted slightly, the brief shadow of concern that crossed his face suggesting that capital requirements were indeed a challenge he was still navigating. "We're well capitalized," he said carefully, "though obviously we're always looking for the right kind of strategic investors who understand the long-term potential of what we're building." Strategic investors. The phrase hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that neither of us was quite ready to address directly. I recognized it as David's careful way of indicating that his business might benefit from additional funding while maintaining the fiction that he was in control of his financial situation and didn't need help from anyone, least of all his supposedly limited mother. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of our server, a young man with carefully styled hair and the kind of attentive professionalism that suggested he was either an aspiring actor or a graduate student earning money. While pursuing more ambitious goals, David ordered the grass-fed beef tenderloin with truffle risotto, while I chose the pan-seared halibut with seasonal vegetables, both selections reflecting the kind of careful attention to quality and presentation that characterized everything about this establishment. While we waited for our food, David returned to his earlier theme about my financial planning, approaching the subject with the kind of gentle persistence that suggested he had been thinking about it since our conversation earlier in the week. "I've been doing some research on those emerging market investments we discussed," he said, pulling out his phone to reference notes he had apparently made. "There are definitely some interesting opportunities, but I want to make sure you understand the risk profile before you commit to anything too aggressive." I reached into my purse to retrieve the folder of documents I had prepared for this moment, my heart rate increasing slightly as I prepared to execute the first phase of the plan Jonathan and I had developed. The folder contained a mixture of legitimate papers, tax documents and insurance information, and other mundane financial records, along with the carefully crafted investment statements that would begin David's education about his mother's true capabilities. "Actually, I brought some of my financial documents with me," I said, opening the folder and pretending to sort through its contents. "I thought you might be able to help me understand some of the statements I've been receiving. Some of the terminology is quite complex." As I had planned, one of the investment statements slipped from the folder and fell to the floor beside David's chair. He bent to retrieve it automatically, his eyes scanning the document as he handed it back to me. I watched his expression change as he processed the information printed on the page, his casual smile fading into something more focused and uncertain. "Mom," he said slowly, his voice carrying a note of confusion that hadn't been there moments earlier. "This statement shows a balance of over $2 million. Is this really yours?" I took the document from his hands, glancing at it as if seeing it clearly for the first time, then looked back at him with an expression of mild embarrassment mixed with resignation. "Oh dear," I said softly. "I didn't mean for you to see that. Yes, it's mine, but it's not something I usually discuss." David stared at me for a long moment, as if trying to reconcile the information on the statement with everything he thought he knew about my financial situation. The number $2.3 million was clearly visible in the account balance section, along with a detailed breakdown of holdings that included blue-chip stocks, government bonds, and several mutual funds with impressive performance records. "I don't understand," he said finally. "How do you have over $2 million invested? Where did this money come from?" I had rehearsed this moment carefully, knowing that my response would set the tone for everything that followed. The key was to seem reluctant to discuss the subject while providing just enough information to satisfy his curiosity without raising suspicions about the true scope of my wealth. "I've been investing for a long time," I said quietly, my voice carrying the kind of hesitant tone that suggested I was sharing information I preferred to keep private. "Much longer than you realize. I started when you were very young, just small. Amounts at first, but over the years it's grown into something more substantial." "But how?" David pressed, his analytical mind clearly working to understand the mathematics of what he was seeing. "Even if you'd been investing consistently for 30 years, this would require significant monthly contributions or exceptional returns." "Both, actually," I admitted, allowing a note of pride to creep into my voice. "I've always been good with numbers, and I spent a lot of time researching companies and market trends. I made some investments that turned out much better than I expected." This was the crucial moment, the point where David would either accept my explanation as plausible or begin asking the kinds of detailed questions that might expose the full extent of my deception. I watched his face carefully, noting the way his skepticism battled with his desire to believe that his mother might be more capable than he had assumed. "What kinds of investments?" he asked, his voice carrying the tone of someone who is trying to understand rather than challenge. I opened the folder again and withdrew several additional statements, documents that Jonathan and I had crafted to show a progression of increasingly sophisticated investment decisions over a period of decades. Early positions in Microsoft and Apple, purchased when they were still relatively unknown companies. A prescient investment in Amazon when it was primarily an online bookstore. More recent positions in Google, Facebook, and other tech giants that had generated substantial returns for early investors. "I always believed that technology was going to change everything," I said, spreading the statements across the table, like evidence in a court case. "So I tried to identify companies that were developing innovations that seemed likely to become widely adopted. It wasn't always easy to know which ones would succeed, but I did my research and tried to make informed decisions." David examined the documents with the kind of intense focus that suggested he was trying to solve a complex puzzle. I could see him calculating returns, estimating the timing of various investments, working backward from the current balances to understand how such positions might have been accumulated over time. "These returns are incredible," he said finally, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "Some of these investments generated 20 or 30 times returns. That's institutional quality performance." "I got lucky," I said modestly, "and I held on to positions longer than most people would have been comfortable with. It's easier to be patient when you're investing money you don't immediately need." This last comment was carefully calculated to address what I knew would be David's next question about how someone with my supposed income could afford to tie up substantial amounts of capital in long-term investments. By suggesting that I had been investing money I didn't need for current expenses, I was implying that my government salary had been sufficient to cover our living costs while allowing me to invest additional funds for the future. "But the amounts?" David said, pointing to one of the early statements. "This shows you investing $50,000 in Apple in 1997. How did you have $50,000 to invest?" I had anticipated this question and prepared an answer that would seem plausible without revealing too much about my actual financial situation. "Insurance settlement," I said simply. "Your father's life insurance policy paid out more than I expected, and I decided to invest most of it rather than spend it. I thought it would be better to use that money to secure our future rather than improve our immediate circumstances." This explanation had several advantages. It accounted for a substantial sum of money without requiring detailed documentation. It explained why I had been able to make significant investments without affecting our day-to-day lifestyle. And it reinforced the narrative that I had been motivated by practical concerns about financial security rather than ambitions about wealth accumulation. David nodded slowly, as if this explanation helped resolve some of his confusion about the mathematics of my investment success. "So, you've been managing this portfolio yourself?" he asked. "No financial advisor? No professional management?" "Mostly myself," I replied, though I have consulted with professionals occasionally when I was considering larger investments or needed advice about tax implications. This was technically true, though it vastly understated the extent of my relationship with Jonathan Kessler and the sophisticated wealth management strategies we had developed together. But David didn't need to know about the offshore accounts, the shell companies, or the complex legal structures that protected the majority of my assets from public scrutiny. Our food arrived as David was processing this information, providing a natural pause in the conversation that allowed both of us to absorb the implications of what had just been revealed. The halibut was perfectly prepared, flaky and tender with a delicate sauce that complemented rather than overwhelmed the fish. But I found it difficult to focus on the meal when I was watching David's face for signs of how he was interpreting these revelations. "I have to admit," he said finally, cutting into his beef with movements that seemed more automatic than deliberate. "This changes how I think about a lot of things. I mean, you've been giving me advice about conservative investing and risk management, but you've actually been taking significant risks and generating exceptional returns. The advice I gave you was appropriate for someone just starting their investment journey," I said carefully. "I wanted you to learn the fundamentals before attempting anything too sophisticated. There's a difference between calculated risks, based on research and experience, and speculation based on enthusiasm or intuition." This seemed to satisfy David's need to reconcile my apparent investment success with the conservative guidance I had provided over the years. He had always preferred explanations that positioned him as the recipient of wisdom rather than the victim of deception, and this framework allowed him to see my previous advice as protective rather than limiting. "So what's the total portfolio worth now?" he asked, his curiosity clearly overcoming any residual skepticism about my capabilities. I had prepared for this question as well, knowing that the number I provided would become the foundation for David's new understanding of my financial situation. Too small, and the revelation would seem insignificant. Too large, and it would raise questions about how someone in my position could have accumulated such wealth. "About $8.5 million, I said quietly, as if the admission made me uncomfortable. Though the markets have been volatile lately, so it fluctuates. $8.5 million. I watched David absorb this figure, noting the way his expression shifted from surprise to something approaching awe. For someone who had spent years explaining my financial limitations to anyone who would listen, the discovery that his mother had accumulated more wealth than most of his successful friends was clearly requiring some significant mental adjustment. $8.5 million, he repeated, as if saying the number aloud would help him process its implications. "Mom, do you realize that puts you in the top 1% of American households? You're not middle class. You're genuinely wealthy." I shrugged as if this classification was something I had never really considered. "I suppose the numbers add up to something substantial," I said. "But I've never thought of myself as wealthy. I still live in the same house, drive the same car, shop at the same stores. The money is just numbers on a statement." This was perhaps the most honest thing I had said during the entire conversation. Despite having accumulated far more wealth than the $8.5 million I was revealing to David, I genuinely had never changed my lifestyle or self-perception in ways that reflected my financial success. The performance of modest circumstances had become so natural that it no longer felt like a performance at all. "But why keep it secret?" David asked, his voice carrying a note of hurt that suggested he was beginning to understand the implications of my long-term deception. "Why let me think you were struggling financially when you've actually been more successful than most professional investors?" This was the question I had been dreading, the one that required me to navigate between honesty and self-protection while avoiding revelations that might expose the full scope of my wealth or the elaborate measures I had taken to hide it. "I wasn't struggling," I said carefully. "I just wasn't advertising my success. You know how people react when they think you have money. Relationships change, expectations change. People start seeing you differently, treating you differently. I preferred to keep things simple. "But I'm your son," David said, his voice rising slightly with emotion. "Don't you think I had a right to know?" I met his eyes directly, allowing him to see some of the genuine emotion that his years of condescension had generated. "And what would you have done with that information?" I asked quietly. "Would it have changed how you saw yourself, how you measured your own success? Would it have affected your motivation, your ambition, your relationships with other people?" David opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly recognizing that these were not simple questions with obvious answers. I could see him thinking about all the times he had used my supposed financial limitations as a way to establish his own superiority, all the conversations where he had positioned himself as the successful one who had transcended his modest origins. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "Maybe. Probably. But that should have been my choice to make." He was right, of course, though not in the way he imagined. The choice to deceive him had been mine, motivated by my own fears and insecurities, as much as by any concern for his well-being. But acknowledging that would require a level of honesty that might lead to questions about what else I had been hiding, and I wasn't prepared for that conversation yet. "You're right," I said simply. "I should have told you sooner. I suppose I got used to keeping it private, and then it became harder to find the right time to bring it up." We finished our meal in relative silence, both of us processing the implications of what had been revealed and what it meant for our relationship going forward. David paid the check with the kind of casual gesture that suggested he was still adjusting to the new dynamic between us, still uncertain about whether his role as the successful son helping his struggling mother had been permanently altered by these revelations. Walking back to the street, David turned to me with an expression that suggested he was still working through the complex emotions that my disclosure had generated. "I need some time to think about all this," he said. "It's a lot to process. But I want you to know that I'm proud of you. What you accomplished, building that kind of wealth while raising me alone, it's remarkable." "Thank you," I said, genuinely touched by the sincerity in his voice. "That means a great deal to me." "I do have one question, though," he continued, his analytical mind clearly still working on the puzzle of my financial success. "If you've been this successful as an investor, why do you still work? Why not retire and enjoy the money you've made?" This was another question I had anticipated, one that required careful navigation between plausible explanations and uncomfortable truths. "I like my work," I said, which was partially true. "And I like the structure it provides, the sense of purpose. The money is important for security, but it's not everything. I'm not ready to define myself entirely by my financial success." David nodded as if this explanation made sense to him, though I could see that he was still processing the broader implications of what he had learned. His poor old mother had turned out to be neither poor nor particularly limited in her understanding of how wealth was created and managed. The woman he had been patronizing for years had actually been more successful as an investor than most of the people whose approval he had been seeking at his party. That evening, I sat in my living room thinking about the conversation and its aftermath. The revelation had gone exactly as Jonathan and I had planned, with David accepting the explanation I had provided and seeming to believe that $8.5 million represented the full extent of my financial success. But I also recognized that this was only the beginning of a longer process that would require careful management and constant attention to detail. David would inevitably have more questions as he processed what he had learned. He would want to understand more about my investment philosophy, my research methods, my decision-making process. He might even ask to see additional documentation or suggest that I consider more sophisticated investment strategies that could help me optimize my returns. Each of these conversations would require careful preparation to ensure that my responses remained consistent with the limited disclosure I had made while avoiding revelations that might expose the true scope of my wealth. But for now, I was satisfied that the first phase of the plan had been successful. David had learned that his mother was significantly more capable and successful than he had assumed, but not so capable or successful as to seem impossible or suspicious. He had been forced to reconsider his assumptions about my intelligence and sophistication, but not forced to confront the full extent of his own ignorance about the woman who had raised him. Most importantly, the power dynamic between us had shifted in ways that would make it more difficult for him to dismiss my opinions or treat me with the kind of casual condescension that had become his default mode of interaction. He could no longer position himself as the financial expert, educating his naive mother about the realities of money and success. Instead, he would have to acknowledge that I had been quietly successful while he was still learning the basics of wealth management. The phone rang at 9 o'clock, interrupting my reflections on the day's events. It was David, his voice carrying the kind of excited energy that suggested he had been thinking about our conversation all afternoon. "Mom, I've been doing some research on your portfolio," he said without preamble. "Those early tech investments were incredibly prescient. I mean, most professional fund managers missed those opportunities completely. How did you know to get in so early?" I smiled to myself, recognizing that David was beginning to see me in a completely different light. Not as someone who had gotten lucky with a few stock picks, but as someone who possessed genuine analytical capabilities that had allowed me to identify exceptional opportunities before they became obvious to the broader market. "Research," I said simply. I read everything I could find about the companies, their management teams, their competitive advantages, their market potential. I tried to understand not just what they were doing, but why they were likely to succeed where others might fail. "But where did you learn to do that kind of analysis?" David pressed. "I mean, that's sophisticated stuff. Most people with finance degrees struggle with that level of strategic thinking." This was exactly the kind of question that could lead to dangerous territory if I wasn't careful. David was beginning to understand that my investment success required capabilities that went far beyond lucky guessing, but I needed to provide explanations that seemed plausible without revealing the full extent of my knowledge or the professional resources I had access to. "I've always been curious about how businesses work," I said, "and I had time to research since I was investing for the long term. When you're not trying to make quick profits, you can afford to really understand what you're buying." This seemed to satisfy David's immediate curiosity, though I could hear in his voice that he was still processing the broader implications of what he had learned. His mother had not only been more successful than he had realized, but she had achieved that success through the same kind of analytical rigor and strategic thinking that he prided himself on in his own business ventures. "Listen," he said, his voice taking on the tone he used when he was about to propose something he was particularly excited about. "I'd love to learn more about your investment approach. Maybe we could meet regularly to discuss market opportunities, share ideas about potential investments. I think we could both benefit from that kind of collaboration." Collaboration. The word carried implications that both thrilled and terrified me. On one hand, the prospect of having honest conversations with David about investment strategies and market analysis was genuinely appealing. For years, I had been forced to hide my expertise and pretend ignorance about topics that I found intellectually stimulating. The possibility of sharing that part of myself with my son, even in limited ways, was something I had never imagined could happen. On the other hand, collaboration would require ongoing deception of a much more complex and demanding nature. I would need to consistently present myself as someone who had achieved modest success through diligent research and conservative risk-taking, while hiding the fact that my actual investment activities were far more sophisticated and far more successful than anything I could safely reveal. Every conversation would be a performance, every piece of advice carefully calibrated to seem consistent with the limited capabilities I was claiming to possess. "I'd enjoy that," I said finally, recognizing that refusing his offer would seem suspicious and out of character for someone who had just been revealed to be a successful investor. Though I should warn you that my approach is quite conservative compared to what you're probably used to. Conservative, but effective, David E. Cobinquis replied. $8.5 million speaks for itself. After hanging up, I sat in my quiet living room thinking about the conversation and what it meant for the future of my relationship with David. The revelation had been successful in the sense that it had forced him to see me as more capable and sophisticated than he had previously assumed. But it had also created new challenges and new opportunities that I would need to navigate carefully. David was no longer the condescending son explaining basic financial concepts to his naive mother, but he was also not yet someone who understood or respected the full scope of my capabilities. He had learned that I was more successful than he had realized, but he still believed that his own expertise exceeded mine, and that our collaboration would primarily benefit me rather than him. The irony was that David's new respect for my investment abilities was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of their true nature. He saw $8.5 million as evidence of exceptional skill and remarkable success, not knowing that it represented less than 20% of my actual wealth. He was impressed by the early tech investments that Jonathan and I had documented in the fabricated portfolio, not knowing that my real investment history included dozens of similar successes that had generated far larger returns. But perhaps that was exactly as it should be. David needed to learn humility and develop respect for capabilities he had previously dismissed, but he wasn't ready to confront the full extent of his own ignorance about the woman who had raised him. The partial revelation would give him time to adjust his assumptions and reconsider his attitudes, while protecting both of us from the more dramatic confrontation that complete honesty would require. Tomorrow, I would call Jonathan to report on the success of our first phase and begin planning for the more complex challenges that lay ahead. David would undoubtedly have more questions, more requests for information, more suggestions about how I might optimize my investment strategy. Each of these interactions would require careful choreography to maintain the fiction that $8.5 million represented the full extent of my financial success. But tonight, for the first time in years, I had the satisfaction of knowing that my son saw me as someone worthy of respect rather than pity, someone whose opinions mattered rather than someone whose limitations needed to be managed. It was a small victory, but it felt like the beginning of something much larger and much more important than David could possibly imagine. The transformation in David's behavior began immediately, manifesting in ways both subtle and obvious that revealed just how profoundly my disclosure had affected his understanding of our relationship. Where once he had answered my phone calls with the patient tone of someone preparing to dispense wisdom to a less sophisticated audience, now his voice carried genuine excitement and curiosity, as if he were speaking to a peer whose opinions might actually influence his own thinking. 3 days after our lunch at Greystone Manor, he called me at 7 in the morning. A time when he would previously have assumed I was still getting ready for my mundane government job, but now seemed to understand as a reasonable hour for discussing serious financial matters with someone who had demonstrated real expertise in wealth management. "Mom, I've been thinking about something all night," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the kind of energetic intensity that suggested he had barely slept. "That Amazon position you showed me, the one from 1997. You bought in at $12 a share and held it through the dot-com crash, through all the volatility and uncertainty. Most professional investors sold during the downturn, but you held on and rode it all the way up. That takes incredible conviction and strategic thinking." I settled into my kitchen chair with my coffee, noting how different this conversation felt from our previous discussions about investing. David was no longer explaining concepts to me. He was analyzing my decisions with the kind of respect typically reserved for accomplished fund managers or successful entrepreneurs. "I believed in the long-term vision," I said carefully, drawing on the extensive research I had done about Amazon's early history to construct a plausible explanation for my investment thesis. The company was clearly disrupting traditional retail models, and Jeff Bezos seemed to understand that short-term losses were acceptable if they led to long-term market dominance. But how did you know to ignore the conventional wisdom about the stock being overvalued? David pressed. I've been reading analyst reports from that period, and almost everyone was saying that online retail was a fad, that people would never abandon traditional shopping patterns for internet purchases. This was exactly the kind of detailed questioning I had expected as David attempted to understand the analytical framework that had supposedly guided my investment decisions. I had prepared for these conversations by studying the historical context of each major position in the fabricated portfolio, developing coherent explanations that would satisfy his curiosity without revealing the true sophistication of my actual investment process. I spent a lot of time in bookstores during those years, I replied, allowing a note of nostalgia to enter my voice. Watching how people shopped, listening to their conversations about convenience and selection and pricing, it seemed obvious to me that if someone could offer a better experience with lower costs, traditional retailers would struggle to compete. That's brilliant, David said, and I could hear genuine admiration in his voice. You were doing consumer behavior research before most analysts even understood what that meant. You were thinking like a strategist, not just a stock picker. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with David asking increasingly sophisticated questions about my investment philosophy, my research methods, and my approach to risk management. I found myself walking a careful line between demonstrating sufficient knowledge to maintain his newfound respect while avoiding revelations that might suggest capabilities beyond what someone in my supposed circumstances could reasonably possess. When we finally hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen thinking about how strange it felt to discuss investment strategies with my son, even in this limited and carefully controlled way. For years, I had been forced to listen to his condescending explanations of basic financial concepts while hiding my own far superior understanding of market dynamics and wealth creation. Now, for the first time, we were having something approaching an honest conversation about topics that genuinely interested both of us. The irony was that David's new respect for my capabilities was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of their true scope. He was impressed by investment returns that represented a tiny fraction of my actual success, analyzing decisions that were carefully selected examples rather than representative samples of my overall strategy. But even this limited glimpse into my financial sophistication had been enough to completely reshape his perception of my intelligence and competence. 2 days later, David surprised me by suggesting that we meet for coffee to discuss a specific investment opportunity he was considering for his own portfolio. The location he chose was a small cafe in his neighborhood, the kind of place that served artisanal beverages and attracted the sort of clientele that valued intellectual conversation over ostentatious display. It was a marked departure from the expensive restaurants and exclusive venues he typically preferred for our meetings, suggesting that he now saw our relationship as something more collaborative and less performative. He was already seated when I arrived, surrounded by printed research reports and handwritten notes that indicated he had been preparing for this conversation with the kind of thoroughness he typically reserved for important business meetings. The sight of my son treating my opinions as worthy of serious preparation was both gratifying and unsettling, a reminder of how dramatically our dynamic had shifted in just a few days. I wanted to get your perspective on a biotech company I've been researching, he said as I settled into the chair across from him. Nexus Therapeutics. They're working on a revolutionary treatment for type 1 diabetes, something that could potentially eliminate the need for insulin injections entirely. I accepted the research packet he handed me, scanning the financial statements and clinical trial data while drawing on my extensive knowledge of biotechnology investing to formulate a response that would seem informed but not suspiciously sophisticated. Interesting science, I said after reviewing the materials. The approach looks promising, and the management team has solid experience. What's your timeline for this kind of investment? That's what I wanted to discuss with you, David replied, leaning forward with the kind of focused attention that suggested my opinion would significantly influence his decision. The company is planning to go public next month, and early investors can get in at a substantial discount to the expected IPO price. But it requires a minimum investment of $250,000. $250,000. The amount was significant enough to represent a major financial commitment for someone with David's resources, but small enough to seem reasonable for someone who supposedly possessed an $8 million portfolio. I recognized this as a test of sorts, an attempt to understand whether my disclosed wealth was sufficient to support the kind of aggressive investment strategies that David was beginning to contemplate. "That's a substantial commitment," I said, carefully. "Have you considered the risk profile? Biotech companies can be extremely volatile, especially during the clinical trial process. Even promising treatments can fail unexpectedly." "I have," David replied, "but the potential returns are extraordinary. If the treatment works and gets FDA approval, early investors could see 10 or 20 times returns, maybe more." I studied his face, noting the excitement in his expression and recognizing the same kind of enthusiasm that had led me to make some of my most successful investments over the years. David had always been intelligent and analytically minded, but this was the first time I had seen him approach an investment opportunity with the kind of rigorous research and strategic thinking that separated successful investors from lucky speculators. "What does your research tell you about the competitive landscape?" I asked. "Are there other companies working on similar treatments? What happens if someone else gets to market first?" David's expression brightened as he realized I was taking his investment thesis seriously rather than simply offering cautionary advice about the dangers of speculation. "That's the beautiful part," he said, pulling out additional documents to support his analysis. "Nexus has a significant head start because of their proprietary delivery mechanism. Even if competitors develop similar treatments, they won't be able to replicate the patient experience that Nexus is creating." We spent the next hour discussing the technical aspects of the treatment, the regulatory pathway for approval, the market size for diabetes therapies, and the financial projections that supported David's optimistic assessment of the investment's potential. I found myself genuinely impressed by the depth of his research and the sophistication of his analysis, even as I recognized several important factors that he had overlooked or underestimated. "It sounds like you've done your homework," I said finally. "The science looks promising, and you're right about the market opportunity. But have you considered the manufacturing challenges? Bringing a complex biological treatment to scale is enormously expensive and technically difficult." This was exactly the kind of insight that someone with my actual experience in biotech investing would immediately recognize. But that might not be obvious to someone conducting their first serious analysis of the sector. I watched David process this consideration, noting how his enthusiasm tempered slightly as he realized there were additional risk factors to consider. "I hadn't thought about manufacturing," he admitted. "Is that something that typically derails promising treatments?" "Sometimes," I replied. "It's worth researching their production plans and making sure they have adequate capital to scale up if the trials are successful. The last thing you want is to invest in a company that develops a breakthrough treatment but can't manufacture it profitably." David nodded thoughtfully, making notes about additional research he needed to conduct before finalizing his investment decision. I could see that he was processing not just the specific information I had provided, but the broader lesson about the importance of comprehensive due diligence and systematic risk assessment. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his tone becoming more personal. "How do you stay so disciplined about analyzing the downside risks? I mean, when you see an opportunity that could generate exceptional returns, don't you get excited enough to overlook potential problems?" This was perhaps the most insightful question David had ever asked me about investing, and it revealed that he was beginning to understand one of the fundamental psychological challenges that separated successful long-term investors from those who experienced dramatic gains and losses. "Experience," I said simply. "I've learned that the most dangerous investments are often the ones that seem most exciting. When everything looks perfect, that's usually when you need to look harder for what might go wrong. Is that why you've been so successful over the long term? David asked. Because you focus on avoiding losses rather than maximizing gains? I considered this question carefully, recognizing that my answer would influence how David thought about investment strategy for years to come. The truth was that my success had come from a combination of rigorous analysis, sophisticated risk management, and access to information and opportunities that weren't available to typical individual investors. But I needed to provide an explanation that seemed consistent with the more modest capabilities I was claiming to possess. Partly, I said, but it's also about patience and conviction. When you really understand what you're buying and why you're buying it, you can hold through the inevitable volatility and uncertainty. Most people sell at exactly the wrong times because they don't have confidence in their original analysis. And this seemed to resonate with David, who nodded as if I had articulated something he had been struggling to understand about his own approach to investing. That's what I admire most about your Amazon position, he said. Holding through the .com crash required incredible conviction. Most people would have panicked and sold at a massive loss. The conversation was interrupted by David's phone buzzing with what appeared to be an urgent message. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting from relaxed engagement to focused concern. "Sorry, I need to take this," he said, stepping away from the table to answer a call that seemed to involve some crisis at his consulting firm. While he was occupied, I took the opportunity to study the research materials he had prepared for our discussion. His analysis of Nexus Therapeutics was genuinely impressive, demonstrating the kind of systematic approach and attention to detail that suggested he had natural aptitude for investment research. But I also noticed several gaps in his understanding of biotech investing specifically, areas where his general business knowledge wasn't sufficient to fully evaluate the unique risks and opportunities in this sector. When David returned to the table, his expression suggested that whatever crisis had interrupted our conversation was more serious than a routine business problem. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Define okay," he replied with a rueful smile. "One of our biggest clients just decided to terminate their contract early. It's not a disaster, but it's definitely going to affect our revenue projections for the next 2 quarters. I could see that David was processing the financial implications of this development, calculating how it might affect his own compensation and his ability to make the kind of aggressive investments we had been discussing. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said. "These things happen in consulting. Clients change their priorities, budgets get cut, strategic directions shift. The important thing is to have enough diversification that no single client can seriously damage your business." "That's exactly what I've been thinking," David said. "Which is why I'm even more interested in opportunities like Nexus. If I can generate exceptional returns on my personal investments, it gives me more flexibility to ride out the inevitable ups and downs in the business." This was a reasonable approach in theory, but I could see that David was making the classic mistake of trying to compensate for business uncertainty by taking excessive risks in his investment portfolio. The desire to generate quick profits to offset unexpected losses was one of the most common psychological traps that destroyed otherwise intelligent investors. "Just remember that investment returns take time to materialize," I said gently. "Even successful biotech investments typically require years to generate substantial profits. You don't want to put yourself in a position where you need quick returns from long-term investments?" David nodded, but I could see that his enthusiasm for the Nexus opportunity was being amplified by his concern about the client situation. He was beginning to see aggressive investing as a solution to his business challenges, rather than a separate activity that required its own careful risk management. "What would you do?" he asked directly. "If you were in my position, would you make the investment?" This was the moment I had been dreading, the point where David was asking me to provide specific advice that could significantly impact his financial future. The truth was that Nexus Therapeutics was indeed a promising investment opportunity, one that I had actually been considering for my own portfolio. But recommending it to David would require me to balance his best interests against the need to maintain my carefully constructed persona as a conservative investor with limited expertise. I would do more research first, I said finally, specifically about the manufacturing questions we discussed, and about the company's capital requirements for scaling production. If those factors check out positively, then it might be worth considering a smaller initial investment to test your thesis. Smaller how? David asked. Maybe 50 or 75,000 instead of the full minimum, I suggested. Enough to participate meaningfully if your analysis is correct, but not so much that a failure would seriously damage your portfolio. David frowned, clearly disappointed by my conservative recommendation. But that would significantly limit the potential returns, he said. If I'm right about this opportunity, the difference between a $50,000 investment and a $250,000 investment could be millions of dollars over the long term. And if you're wrong, I replied, the difference could be between a manageable loss and a catastrophic one. Remember, successful investing is about staying in the game long enough for your good decisions to compound. Taking excessive risks, even on promising opportunities, can end your investing career before you've had time to develop real expertise. This was advice I genuinely believed, based on decades of experience watching intelligent people destroy their wealth through poor risk management. But I also recognized that my conservative recommendations were influenced by the fact that David was unaware of my resources and my ability to provide financial support if his investments failed catastrophically. The conversation ended with David agreeing to conduct additional research before making his final decision about Nexus Therapeutics, though I could see that he was frustrated by what he perceived as my excessive caution. Walking home from the cafe, I found myself thinking about the complex dynamics that were emerging in our relationship as a result of my partial disclosure. On one hand, David now respected my investment capabilities and sought my advice on important financial decisions. This was exactly what I had hoped to achieve through the revelation of my supposed $8 million portfolio. But on the other hand, his newfound respect was creating expectations and responsibilities that I wasn't sure I was prepared to handle. David was beginning to see me as a potential mentor and collaborator in his investment activities, someone whose guidance could help him navigate complex financial decisions and avoid costly mistakes. But providing that guidance required me to maintain an extremely careful balance between demonstrating sufficient expertise to be helpful while avoiding revelations that might expose the true scope of my knowledge and resources. More troubling was the realization that David's financial situation might be more precarious than I had understood. The loss of a major client at his consulting firm, combined with his eagerness to make aggressive investments, suggested that he was under more pressure than he typically revealed. His lifestyle and spending patterns had been calibrated for a level of income that might not be sustainable if his business continued to experience setbacks. That evening, I called Jonathan Kessler to discuss the evolving situation and its implications for our long-term strategy. The good news is that Phase 1 was completely successful, I told him, settling into my home office with a glass of wine and the detailed notes I had made about my conversation with David. He fully accepts the $8.5 million portfolio as legitimate, and he's treating me as a serious investor rather than a naive amateur. And the bad news? Jonathan asked, his tone suggesting he could hear the underlying concern in my voice. He wants to involve me in his investment decisions, I said. He's asking for specific advice about individual opportunities, and he's starting to see our relationship as a collaborative partnership rather than just a son learning from his mother. Jonathan was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of this development. That's more complicated than we anticipated, he said finally. Providing ongoing investment advice requires a level of engagement that increases the risk of inconsistencies or inadvertent revelations. Exactly, I replied. And there's another factor we didn't fully consider. David's business seems to be experiencing some financial pressure. He's looking at aggressive investments partly because he needs exceptional returns to maintain his current lifestyle. That changes the calculus significantly, Jonathan said. If he's making investment decisions based on immediate financial needs rather than long-term strategy, the advice you provide becomes much more consequential. We spent the next hour discussing potential approaches to managing these new complexities. The challenge was that David's respect for my investment capabilities was creating opportunities for genuine engagement and collaboration that I had never expected, but also responsibilities and risks that could compromise the elaborate deception we had constructed. I think we need to consider Phase 2 sooner than originally planned, Jonathan said eventually. If David is going to continue seeking your advice and involving you in his financial planning, he needs to have a more complete understanding of your resources and capabilities. Phase 2 involved revealing additional assets that would bring my disclosed wealth to approximately $15 million, still a fraction of my actual holdings, but substantial enough to support more sophisticated investment advice and potentially more direct financial assistance if David encountered serious difficulties. What would trigger the additional disclosure? I asked. His investment decisions, Jonathan replied. If he's determined to pursue aggressive strategies despite your conservative advice, it might be better for him to understand that you have the resources to provide a safety net if things go badly. This was a reasonable approach in theory, but it also represented a significant escalation in the complexity and risk of our deception. Each additional revelation would require more elaborate explanations and more careful management to maintain consistency with the story we had already established. Let me think about it, I said finally. I want to see how he handles the Nexus Therapeutics decision before we make any major changes to our approach. After hanging up with Jonathan, I spent the evening reviewing David's research materials and conducting my own analysis of the biotech investment he was considering. The truth was that Nexus Therapeutics was indeed a promising opportunity. One that met most of my criteria for early-stage biotech investments. The science was solid, the management team was experienced, and the market opportunity was substantial enough to support significant returns if the treatment proved successful. But I also knew from my extensive experience in this sector that David's analysis had overlooked several critical risk factors that could derail even the most promising biotech investments. Regulatory delays, manufacturing challenges, competitive threats, and capital requirements were all potential problems that could prevent Nexus from achieving the exceptional returns that David was projecting. The question was whether to share this more sophisticated analysis with David, potentially revealing capabilities that seemed inconsistent with my supposed background, or to maintain my conservative recommendations and watch him potentially make a significant mistake based on incomplete information. It was a dilemma that captured the broader challenge of our evolving relationship. The more involved I became in David's financial decisions, the more difficult it became to maintain the careful balance between helpful guidance and dangerous revelation. But the alternative, watching my son make potentially catastrophic mistakes, while possessing the knowledge and resources to help him, was equally unacceptable. 2 days later, David called with an update on his research into the manufacturing questions I had raised about Nexus Therapeutics. "You were absolutely right to point that out," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and concern. "The company has identified manufacturing as a major challenge, and they're going to need at least $50 million in additional capital to build production facilities if their treatment gets approved." "And do they have access to that capital?" I asked. "That's unclear," David replied. "They're planning another funding round after the IPO, but there's no guarantee they'll be able to raise money at attractive terms, especially if the broader biotech market experiences volatility." This was exactly the kind of sophisticated risk analysis that I had hoped David would develop through our conversations. He was learning to think beyond the immediate investment opportunity to consider. the broader operational and financial challenges that could affect long-term returns. "So what are you thinking now?" I asked. "I'm still interested," David said. "But maybe you're right about starting with a smaller position. If I invest $50,000 now and the company executes successfully on their manufacturing plans, I can always add to the position later." This was a reasonable approach that balanced David's enthusiasm for the opportunity with appropriate risk management. It also demonstrated that he was beginning to internalize the lessons about patience and disciplined investing that I had been trying to teach him. "That sounds prudent," I said. "And it gives you time to learn more about biotech investing before committing larger amounts of capital to the sector." "Actually, that's something else I wanted to discuss with you," David said. "I've been thinking about our collaboration, and I wonder if we might consider making some joint investments, pooling our research and capital to pursue opportunities that might be too large or too complex for either of us to handle individually." Joint investments. The suggestion was both thrilling and terrifying, representing the kind of genuine partnership that I had never imagined could develop between David and me, but also a level of financial entanglement that could make it impossible to maintain my carefully constructed deceptions. "That's an interesting idea," I said carefully. "What did you have in mind?" "Well, for example, the Nexus opportunity requires a minimum investment of $250,000, David explained. "If we each contributed half, we could access the full minimum while limiting our individual exposure, and we could share the research burden for evaluating future opportunities." The proposal was reasonable from David's perspective, but it would require me to provide detailed explanations for every investment decision, submit to ongoing scrutiny of my financial resources, and potentially reveal inconsistencies between my supposed capabilities and my actual expertise. "Let me think about that," I said. "It's an intriguing possibility, but it would require some careful planning to make sure we're both comfortable with the arrangement." After ending the call, I sat in my kitchen thinking about how quickly our relationship was evolving and how difficult it was becoming to predict the consequences of each conversation and each revelation. David was no longer the condescending son explaining basic financial concepts to his naive mother, but he was also not yet someone who understood the true nature of the woman who had raised him. The partial honesty I had introduced into our relationship was creating opportunities for genuine connection and collaboration that I had never expected, but it was also generating pressures and expectations that might eventually force me to choose between complete revelation and catastrophic deception. The game had become more complex than I had anticipated, and I was no longer certain that I could predict or control its ultimate outcome. The decision to reveal the full truth came 3 weeks later, not through careful planning, but through a crisis that stripped away every pretense and forced me to choose between maintaining my deception and saving my son from financial ruin. David's consulting firm had been hemorrhaging clients faster than he had initially admitted, and his desperate attempt to generate quick returns through aggressive investing had backfired spectacularly. The Nexus Therapeutics investment, which we had both carefully researched and which had seemed so promising, had collapsed overnight when the FDA rejected their treatment application due to unexpected safety concerns that emerged during final trials. The phone call came at 6 in the morning, David's voice hollow and defeated in a way I had never heard before. "Mom, I need to tell you something," he said, and I could hear the tremor of barely controlled panic beneath his words. "The Nexus investment is gone, all of it. But that's not the worst part." I sat up in bed, my heart racing as I recognized the tone of someone whose world was crashing down around them. "What happened?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "I didn't just invest the $50,000 we discussed," David admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "When the stock started rising in the first few weeks, I got confident. I borrowed against my apartment, took cash advances on credit cards, even convinced Sophia to invest her trust fund money. I put in almost $800,000 total. $800,000. The number hit me like a physical blow, not because of the amount itself, but because of what it represented about David's psychological state and his complete abandonment of the risk management principles we had discussed. "David," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice calm despite the storm of emotions churning in my chest. "Are you telling me you're now $800,000 in debt?" "More than that," he whispered. "The margin calls started yesterday. The credit card companies are demanding immediate payment. And Sophia..." His voice trailed off, but I could fill in the rest. The girlfriend who had moved in after his party, who had believed in his success story and his bright future, had discovered that her trust fund money was gone and was undoubtedly reconsidering her relationship with someone who had proven to be financially reckless rather than financially sophisticated. I closed my eyes, thinking about the elaborate deception I had maintained for so many years, and the careful performance I had given to protect David from the knowledge of my true wealth. All of that careful planning seemed suddenly meaningless in the face of his immediate crisis. "Where are you now?" I asked. "In my car," David replied. "I couldn't stay in the apartment. Sophia left last night, and the building manager is already asking questions about the mortgage payments. I think I might lose everything, Mom. The business, the apartment, maybe even my ability to work in consulting if word gets out about how badly I mismanaged my finances." The raw desperation in his voice made my decision for me. I could continue playing the role of the modestly successful mother with $8 million in conservative investments, someone who might be able to help with a small loan but couldn't, possibly solve a crisis of this magnitude. Or I could finally tell him the truth about who I really was and what I was actually capable of. "David," I said, my voice taking on a tone of absolute certainty that seemed to surprise even me. "I need you to listen very carefully. Come to my house right now. Don't stop anywhere. Don't talk to anyone else. Just come here immediately." "Mom, I don't think you understand how serious this is," David said. "This isn't something that can be fixed with family support or good intentions. I need almost $1 million just to break even, and that's before addressing the business problems that caused this situation in the first place." "I understand exactly how serious it is," I replied, "and I need you to trust me when I tell you that we're going to fix this. All of it. But first, you need to get here so we can have a conversation that's long overdue." There was something in my voice that seemed to cut through David's panic and despair, a confidence and authority that he had never heard from me before. He agreed to come over, though I could tell he was skeptical about what I could possibly do to address a financial crisis of this magnitude. I spent the 20 minutes before his arrival making phone calls and sending secure messages to Jonathan Kessler, arranging for immediate access to liquid funds and emergency financial support that would allow us to address David's situation within hours rather than days. The infrastructure I had built to manage and protect my wealth was designed for exactly this kind of crisis, though I had never imagined I would be using it to save my son from the consequences of his own financial recklessness. When David arrived, he looked worse than I had expected. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his eyes were red from lack of sleep, and his entire demeanor suggested someone who had been forced to confront the complete collapse of everything he had believed about himself and his capabilities. "Sit down," I said, guiding him to the living room where we had had so many conversations over the years, most of them built on carefully constructed lies and mutual deceptions. "Before we discuss solutions, I need to tell you something about your mother that you've never known." David looked at me with an expression of confusion mixed with hope, as if he was trying to understand how the woman he had dismissed as financially unsophisticated could possibly project the kind of confidence I was demonstrating in the face of his crisis. "The $8.5 million I showed you," I began, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to reveal. "That represents approximately 15% of my actual holdings. Your poor old mother, The one you've been explaining basic financial concepts to for years has a net worth of $53 million. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sound of traffic on the street outside. David stared at me as if I had suddenly begun speaking a foreign language, his mind clearly struggling to process information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about our family's financial situation. "That's impossible," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you had that much money, I would have known. There would have been signs, evidence, changes in how we lived." I reached for my laptop and opened the secure portal that provided real-time access to my complete financial picture. The screen displayed account balances, investment positions, real estate holdings, and business interests that painted a picture of wealth that exceeded not just David's expectations, but his ability to immediately comprehend. "The signs were there," I said quietly. "You just chose not to see them because they didn't fit the narrative you needed to believe about yourself and your achievements. How did you think I paid for your private school education on a government salary? How did you think I managed to support your college expenses, your living costs, your early career development, all while maintaining a comfortable lifestyle and apparently building a modest investment portfolio?" David scrolled through the financial statements with an expression of growing shock and disbelief. The numbers were too large, too consistent, too well documented to be fabricated or explained away. "You've been lying to me," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of hurt and anger that I had expected but still found painful to hear. "For years, decades, you've been pretending to be someone you're not while I made a fool of myself explaining things you already understood better than I did." "Yes," I admitted, recognizing that this moment required complete honesty rather than careful explanations or partial truths. "I've been lying to you because I thought it was protecting both of us. I thought allowing you to see me as limited would help you feel successful and confident. I thought hiding my wealth would prevent it from becoming a complication in your life or our relationship." "A complication?" David's voice was rising now, the emotional impact of my revelation beginning to overwhelm his shock. "Do you realize what you put me through? Do you understand how it felt to think I was the successful one in this family while you struggled to understand basic financial concepts? I spent years feeling sorry for you, trying to help you, explaining things you already knew." I could see that David's anger was masking a deeper hurt, the realization that our entire relationship had been built on a foundation of deception that had shaped his self-perception and his understanding of his place in the world. "You're right to be angry," I said. "I made choices that affected you without giving you the opportunity to participate in those decisions. But I need you to understand that those choices were motivated by love, even if they were ultimately misguided." "Love?" David stood up, abruptly, beginning to pace around the living room as he processed the implications of what he had learned. "How is lying to someone for 30 years an expression of love? How is allowing them to develop a completely false understanding of reality an act of care?" These were fair questions that I had been asking myself since the moment I decided to reveal the truth. The elaborate deception I had maintained had indeed been motivated by a desire to protect David, but it had also been shaped by my own fears and insecurities in ways that I was only beginning to fully understand. "Because I was afraid," I said simply. "Afraid that if you knew the truth about my wealth, it would change how you saw yourself and how you related to the world. Afraid that you would become dependent rather than independent, entitled rather than motivated. Afraid that my money would become a barrier between us rather than a source of security." David stopped pacing and turned to face me directly, his expression suggesting that he was beginning to understand the complexity of the situation rather than simply reacting to its immediate emotional impact. "So instead, you let me become someone who was cruel to you," he said quietly. "Someone who treated you with condescension and disrespect because I thought I was superior to you. Someone who used your supposed limitations as a way to make myself feel better about my own insecurities. This was the moment I had been dreading. The point where David would have to confront not just my deception, but his own behavior, and what it revealed about his character. The man who had called me poor old mom at his party, who had explained my psychological barriers to wealth creation to a room full of strangers, was being forced to recognize that his cruelty had been directed at someone who possessed far more knowledge and capability than he had ever demonstrated. You became someone who was shaped by false information, I said gently, but you also became someone who was willing to seek my advice and value my opinions once you learned I had some level of financial success. The capacity for respect and collaboration was always there. It just needed the right circumstances to emerge. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the magnitude of what had been revealed and what it meant for our relationship going forward. Finally, David looked up at me with an expression that suggested he was ready to move beyond the immediate emotional impact of my disclosure. "Can you really fix this?" he asked, gesturing toward the laptop screen that still displayed the evidence of my vast wealth. "Can you make this crisis go away?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Within 24 hours, all of your debts can be paid, your credit restored, and your business stabilized. The money you lost on the Nexus investment can be replaced, and you can have a fresh start with a clear understanding of both your capabilities and your limitations." "And what would you want in return?" David asked, his tone suggesting he understood that this level of assistance would come with conditions and expectations. "Honesty," I replied. "Complete, ongoing honesty between us about money, about success, about our relationship and our expectations of each other. No more performances, no more deceptions, no more allowing either of us to maintain illusions that prevent us from seeing each other clearly." David nodded slowly, as if he was beginning to understand that my offer represented not just financial rescue, but an opportunity for a fundamentally different kind of relationship. "And what about the money itself?" he asked. "If you save me from this crisis, does that make me dependent on you in ways that could be even more damaging than the current situation?" This was perhaps the most mature and insightful question David had ever asked me, suggesting that he was beginning to think about the psychological and emotional implications of wealth rather than simply its immediate practical applications. "That depends entirely on how we structure the assistance and what you do with the fresh start it provides," I said. "Money can be a tool for growth and independence, or it can be a barrier to both. The choice is ultimately yours." By evening, the immediate crisis had been resolved through a series of wire transfers and account settlements that demonstrated the power and efficiency of sophisticated wealth management. David's debts were eliminated, his credit restored, and his business provided with enough working capital to survive the loss of major clients while rebuilding its customer base. But the more important work was just beginning. David and I spent hours that night discussing not just the mechanics of financial management, but the psychology of wealth, the responsibility that came with privilege, and the ways that money could either enhance or corrupt relationships and character. For the first time in decades, we were having completely honest conversations about success and failure, about fear and ambition, about the choices we had both made and the consequences we had both lived with. It was painful and liberating in equal measure, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths while opening up possibilities for genuine connection that had been impossible under our previous arrangement. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Of course, David struggled with the realization that his entire understanding of his own achievements had been based on false premises. I struggled with the recognition that my well-intentioned deception had caused real harm to someone I loved. But we had finally begun the process of building a relationship based on mutual respect and honest communication, rather than carefully maintained illusions. 6 months later, David's consulting firm had not only recovered, but had grown into something more substantial and sustainable than his previous model. Working together, We had identified investment opportunities that combined his analytical skills with my experience and resources, creating a partnership that was genuinely collaborative rather than performative. More importantly, David had developed a more nuanced understanding of success and failure, recognizing that intelligence and capability could take many forms and that true wealth included emotional and relational assets that couldn't be measured in dollars or displayed at parties. The man who had once called me poor old mom had learned that his mother was neither poor nor old in the ways that truly mattered, and that the greatest fortune any of us could possess was the courage to see each other clearly and love each other honestly. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.